Hi, and welcome to a first thoughts video of The MasterHarper of Pern by Anne McCaffrey. So, I've just finished reading this. This is a first thoughts. I don't know, I might go on and make a more extensive video, but possibly can say everything that I've got to say about it now. So this one was published in 1998, which is significant after the rest of her Dragon series. I have here a copy of Dragonflight. That's actually the same cover that my very first copy of Dragonflight that I had in the 80s. I got rid of it when I was moving one country to another country. And so this, as you can see from that text on the front, was a copy I picked up later, but I still love that cover. I love the later covers where you've got these lush dragons, which are like a quilt painting. And if you ever reprinted Anne McCaffrey books with really beautiful covers and some gold, I think it'd rival the Lovers and those other paintings. Anyway, so the original Dragonflight, which is the first in the series, was originally published in 1969. So they're quite old. I read them when I was in my teens. The characters were amazing. You had strong characters like Lesser. In an era where strong female characters were maybe not as prominent as you might hope. As I've said before, this is the series that first made dragons into something more than beasts to be slain by the knight in pursuit of the maiden. This made them talking, thinking, telepathic in this case, entities that cooperated with humans. So the Anne McCaffrey Dragon series of Pern is amazing for that. Now, in the introduction, Anne McCaffrey says that the MasterHarper of Pern is a book that she was, I think, begged to. Oh, here we go. I have recently been asked via the impressive Del Rey website to explain certain facts which had not been previously brought to light about Pern pre-Dragonflight history, specifically Robinton, apparently. So she told the story from his viewpoint, and that's great. Robinton was a great character. It was great to hear more about him. And in this fairly substantial novel of 463 pages, we hear a lot more about him, and that was good. Like I suspect many people of the Pern books, I found the Harper Hold books as invigorating and exciting as the Were books. I enjoyed them. I think I probably read them more perhaps even than the Were books. And the MasterHarper, Robinton, is a wonderful character. He's there from the very first book. He's very influential. He's very significant in the development of Pern as the threads start to fall again after a 400-year interval. This book will work best for people who have read the previous novels. If you haven't, there's a lot of things of significance here that you won't quite get. You may still enjoy the book, but a lot of the time you're going to be left wondering. Because, pardon me, it's December, it's Queensland, it's like 30 degrees out there, and the air is like soup. Not clear chicken soup, more like a cream soup, humidity. So yes, a new reader to Anne McCaffrey may still enjoy this book. There's a lot to enjoy. I feel like they won't get an awful lot of it. There's many small characters here like Sylvina, like Camo, that we get the backgrounds for that you otherwise wouldn't. Later on in the book, here you get Sibel comes in, and he's a journeyman and he's very important in later Harper Hold books. This tells you the backstory. But for the most part of it, like I suppose the first 2/3 at least, maybe 3/4, what we get is the back history for Master Robinton, who is the MasterHarper by the end of this and by the beginning of this. And it's great. Anne McCaffrey's capacity to create an early background with trials and tribulations that leads to a strong, grounded adult character is supreme. She does it amazingly, and she does it in the vast majority of her Pern books. I have to say, I don't see it as strongly in some of her other series, many of which I also have and thoroughly enjoy. But here you've got Lessa, who is the main female protagonist in Dragonflight. Her backstory, her growing up and everything is amazing. At the same time, her mate, Falar, his backstory is completely different. And the two of them together create a phenomenal story. It's not a love story, but it's a story of two people who come together in a partnership in a way that very few modern love stories do. And as they're both quite young at the time, it shines a light on how formulaic many young adult books with love stories can be today. Anyway, moving back to MasterHarper of Pern. In this book, Anne McCaffrey describes Master Robinton's early life. It describes his mother. It starts before he was born with his mother, who was a master singer at the harper hold, and his father, who was a master composer, and who had little interest in his son's birth. The dynamic is that the man and the woman in their relationship were very strongly connected, and the son, which, though his mother adored him, the father never really connected somehow. And that early part answers questions that many of us had while reading later Harper Hold stories. So when Manoli arrives in the Harper Hold, she was originally sponsored by an old man who eventually finds out was very significant in the Harper Hold, and this tells us the backstory of why he was there. Kinda. Don't say it does a great job of explaining Master Robinton's father and his issues, but it does a job, and it's interesting reading, so I don't mind. Then we have a whole lot of other characters and backstories, and it's basically about Master Harper Robinton, how he achieved the status of Master Harper at a very early age. And it's important that he got it at an early age, because he's then a mature but vigorous man who's there to sponsor Lessa and Falar as threads come back to Pern, and to spur them in the right direction to go and find the holes that were missing. And I really need to read the entire Pern series now, don't I? And I can. I now own all of them and most of the short stories. I've now definitely read all of them, and as far as I know, all of the short stories. So rereading them is a project for another year. I loved the Robinton sequences. I loved while we were describing about them, but later in the book, about so far in, I became slightly disenchanted with what was happening there. You can backstory a lot of stuff. You don't need to backstory everything. And I feel that this book was trying to backstory things that didn't need backstory. So in the last part, and this is spoilers if anyone hasn't read these things, it's a book from 1960s, for goodness sake, you can't spoiler that. So in Dragonflight, it starts off with a holder called Fax, who has taken over 7 holds. That's in complete opposition to the Charter of Pern, where one hold, one holder, and that keeps everyone safe. But this man arises, like many people do arise amongst humanity. He is ambitious. He wants to own many holds. At the end of that book, and at the beginning of this book, at the end of this one, he actually owns 7, and that's not working out too well. He earns them by conquest and by sneaky techniques, which we go into in this book significantly. So if anyone read the early Dragonflight and wondered how Pern got into the dire straits it did with Fax taking so many holds and doing such a bad job of holding, this book will tell you. I'm not convinced though. I'm really not. In the early Dragon series, it talks about how, because there'd been a long interval between the last threads and the next ones, a 400-year interval, the wares had fallen out of favour with the rest of the Pern. Many Pernese didn't believe that they were coming back, and that's a reasonable thing. It's like if you've got a 400-year interval, people's memories are short and they tend to be self-interested. It makes sense that the Wares weren't interested and they didn't want to keep giving stuff to the dragons. It all makes sense. This book, and that's what the early dragon books say, this book tries to re-image that as being completely Fax's fault. So Fax doesn't like Harper's because Harper's tell people their rights and he wants to be a total lord in complete control. Got it? That makes sense. He takes over 7 holds. He controls them badly and cruelly. He doesn't want Harper's involved. Again, it makes sense. But this book re-images all the ills of Pern as being Fax's fault. And I didn't find it convincing because Fax had like 10-15 years to do these things. It makes more sense to me, the description given in the early dragon books, where over 400 years people slowly lost interest in the dragons and lost respect for their role, and slowly, generation by generation, people stopped believing that Fred would ever come again. That makes complete sense to me. The fact that in 10 to 15 years, one particular ambitious guy who keeps killing off other people convinces the whole world that Harpers are bad, Threads will never come again, and all the rest of it. It seemed lazy. It seemed lazy and unnecessary because the Harper hold in itself, with Master Robinson in charge, could have had so many amazing stories. And it has a lot of great stories. I'm not saying don't read this book. I'm saying read it. Because I enjoyed it thoroughly. At the end, when we're making all the wrongs of Pern to be Fax's fault, I'm not convinced. It felt like it was trying too hard to answer questions that maybe never really needed to be asked. And right at the end, this is almost certainly a spoiler if you haven't read the book. I don't know. Right at the end part of the MasterHarper of Pern is essentially the early part of this told from a different vantage. I don't think I needed that. In fact, I'm fairly sure I didn't. This is a spectacular book. It does amazing things. I didn't need MasterHarper Robinson to dress up in Drudge and go and be in the exact same hall where all this occurs. Now, I'm not saying that this will annoy everyone. But it did annoy me a little bit. It didn't feel necessary. It didn't feel spontaneous. There's an element of Deus Ex Machina there because honestly, they did a fine job of their own here without any Master Harper to step in. I don't know why we needed him here. I didn't. I don't know why anyone needed him here. I mean, a lot of people like that strong, what I think of as over-explaining of every last detail. They'll like it that Master Robinson was there to watch what happened that we already knew because we've read the other dragon books. I guess you'll like that. But it did fine without him. We didn't need to put him there, I don't think. So either there's the Deus Ex Machina, Master Robinson is in control of everything, and Fax is the bad guy and did all the bad things, and everything was wonderful until he hustled his way in. Or possibly Anne McCaffrey got a lot of people writing to her, or to Del Rey, saying, we want an explanation, we want a backstory, we can't imagine for ourselves how any of this could have worked, so you need to tell us. Myself, I like imagining things for myself. I have an imagination and I use it. I didn't require the last parts of the MasterHarper of Pern. I agree it's the story of Pern's greatest harper. I didn't need him to be at Roatha when Lesson Flowers' story started. This does a perfectly adequate job of that itself. And it hasn't actually told anything. It hasn't changed anything. It's just told it again from a very similar sometimes perspective. It's like, I don't see the point. There's an element, I suppose, of fulfilling the cycle, maybe. First book starts here. Last book written, if it's the last book, I don't know, we might see more in the future, ends where this starts. 7, 8, 9, a couple of decades later. Sure, if that's what works for you. But there's a few things that I would rather have seen expanded on and the space used for. So we have in the first books the fact that the Master Harpers aren't just harpers and musicians and teachers of ballads and history. All of that they are. But there's also, Robinson has got this amazing spy network that lets him find out what's happening all over the continent in all the different holes behind the scenes. I was actually excited when I started this to see how that network developed. And we do see how that network developed. But to a large extent, it isn't something that Robinson developed. It's something that fell into his lap. So I would have liked to see Robinson as the smart, educated, well-rounded man he is, more strongly involved in creating a spy network that, by these books, is second to none. I like the development of the early characters that I enjoyed in the earlier books. I do like the Master Robinson in this book. I thoroughly enjoyed his backstory. The story of the small mentions that we get in later books about how he had a wife and she died. Well, now we know how that happened. We have expansion on tiny little tidbits that tantalized us. But tiny little tidbits that tantalize us, sometimes they're good. Sometimes what they are is they're just a way to expand on an already story, to give it depth and wealth of experience so that it feels real. There's a lot in MasterHarper of Pern that I think we could have done without. I did enjoy it. I'm definitely hanging on to this copy. I'm certainly going to reread it. I'm very glad to have completed my Pern series so that I can reread them all in sequence one day, like I did with my Terry Pratchett's one year. I'm not saying that it's a bad book. It's not a 5 out of 5 for me. I'd probably give it 4.5. It feels as if for the first 2/3 the author was deeply engrossed in the characters and the narratives and what she was writing. It felt fresh, it felt new. At the end, it almost felt as if she'd suddenly remembered that she had to answer all the questions that all the people had sent her. And that's when the repetitious Deus Ex Machina, I don't know what to call it, started creeping in. Despite all these criticisms, I've got to say Anne McCaffrey on a bad day is about 100 times better than some authors that are out there today getting huge acclamation for their books. At her absolute worst, she has got a lovely turn of phrase. I enjoyed every second of this. I took my time with it. It's a large book. I could have finished it faster, but I allocated reading time. I spent enjoyable moments. With some books, you have this sense that you need to read fast to find out what happens. With this book, you always want to slow yourself down so that you're enjoying every minute. And the other thing about that book now is, I believe now that I've read all of the Pern books, there may never be another one. Maybe there shouldn't even be another one. I don't know. I don't know about that. But now that I've read them all, they are, after all these decades, still a magnificent series within a magnificent concept, groundbreaking dragons, beautiful writing that many authors today could do worse than emulate. And thank you, Anne McCaffrey, who will doubtless never see my niche video. Thank you for having made a teenager seeking strong, determined women available to her. Thank you to a teenager who liked animals more than humans, being given dragons that you could speak to telepathically. Thanks for all the years that I spent flying away with the dragons of Pern. And thank you for your beautiful writing.